If you're somebody that appears as a guest on podcast or is considering being a guest on podcast, in this video, I'm going to break down the only metrics and data that actually matter that you need to be focusing on versus what everybody else tells you that you should be focusing on, but to be honest, is complete BS. If you're new here, I'm Devin Rodriguez, founder of podcastguest.io. We've helped hundreds and hundreds of high-ticket business owners get booked on not only the top podcast on their industry, but more importantly, show them how to convert the attention from those podcasts into paying clients. Now, here's the thing. If you're considering being a guest on podcast, or maybe you've been on a bunch of shows already, like a lot of the clients we worked with have had previously to working with us, what I want to do for you in this video is very simple. I want to show you exactly what to focus on versus what not to focus on, because in this podcast booking industry, quite frankly, it's a bunch of malarkey. There's people that are spewing all of this misinformation, bragging about what types of podcasts you're going to be on. But I just want to start with one foundational truth. If anybody on planet Earth tells you that they know for sure how many people are tuning into the podcast that they are getting you booked on, it is a lie. And the reason why that is because Apple Podcasts and Spotify, the two most popular podcast streaming platforms, do not publicly disclose the download numbers that a podcast gets. Now, here's the interesting thing for you to know. Every podcast has what we call an RSS feed. An RSS feed is pretty much like a phone number for a podcast. But the thing is that phone number is based upon that podcast host's what we call podcast hosting platform. So just like there's AT&T, T-Mobile for cell phones, every podcast has their own hosting platform. Now, the thing is that the hosting platform creates that RSS feed, aka that podcast phone number for a lack of better words. And then what it does is it distributes it to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all of the other audio specifically based podcast streaming services. But here's where things get interesting. The podcast hosts themselves can see their download numbers. In other words, I could go into Buzzsprout, which is the one that I use, and I can see that over the past 7 days, as an example, 1,000 people have listened to my podcast. But the only crappy part about this for you as someone that is considering being a guest on that person's podcast is that you cannot see what that person sees. In other words, all metrics are actually gated behind that person's RSS feed and that person's podcast hosting platform. Now, there are going to be certain tools out there like Raphonic and podcastdb.io that will show you what they call an estimated number of downloads per episode. But even that, a lot of the time, can be extremely inaccurate because they don't even have access to the RSS feeds as well. Nobody does. So the first thing to understand is that unlike YouTube, where you can go to someone's YouTube channel and clearly see how many views they get, how many subscribers they get, you cannot find out that information when it comes to being a guest on somebody's podcast. So one of the things that we do with our clients is we've actually developed something called Podcast Match AI, where we've developed softwares that allow us to calculate the estimated number of listeners that you will reach. However, we are very honest with articulating the fact that that number is not always going to be 100% accurate because that data is not 100% accessible. So with that being said, that's the foundational ground level that I need you to be at with me here, is understanding that not all of the metrics are publicly accessible. And the reason why I bring that up is twofold. Number one, if you're going to go out and do this on your own, don't expect to find the 100% accurate truth behind how many people are actually tuning into the podcast. But number two, and more importantly, I see so much misinformation being spewed by all of these big podcast booking agencies that tell you that they're going to guarantee that you get in front of 100,000, 1 million, 5 million people, but they don't have any way of validating those numbers. And what they instead do is they just try to tell you what you want to hear instead of telling you the truth behind those numbers. Okay, so that's the first thing I need you to understand, is that if anybody comes across or if they try telling you that you're going to get in front of this many people, it's not 100% accurate, so don't think like it is. Second thing I need you to understand is the fact that in this industry, when it comes to getting booked on podcasts, a lot of people get their data from a website that's called listennotes.com. And listennotes.com is a website that you can go on and you'll look up the name of a podcast and it'll tell you based on the metrics, which I'm going to get to in a minute, that that podcast podcast is, example, top 5 globally ranked. In other words, out of the 4+ million podcasts that exist in the world, this podcast is in the top 5%. And what ends up happening is you, as the person going on that podcast, ultimately think that,
wow, this is in the top 5%.
It's got to get me some really great results. And there must be tons of people that are tuning into the podcast because it's in the top 5%. But that could not be further from the truth, because once again, you have to ask yourself the question, where does that data come from? What does the top 5% actually mean? So what did I decide to do? Well, about 3 years ago, my own podcast broke into the top 5% for the first time. I was pumped. I was like, man, this is great. But once again, I went and I looked on Buzzsprout, my podcast hosting platform, and I see, okay, let's see, I must be getting tons of downloads now that I broke into the top 5%. And lo and behold, I was only getting 100 people that were tuning into my podcast on a monthly basis. And somehow I was in the top 5% of podcasts. So that sent me down the rabbit hole. I was like, well, what does that actually mean then? What does top 5% mean? So what I decided to do was email the founder of Listen Notes. And I'm going to look at my screen because he sent me an email that says, please feel free to use the language from this webpage. And then he proceeded to send me a webpage. And then he said, or you can tweak this to fit your narrative. Listen Score by Listen Notes rates podcast opportunity on a scale of 1 to 100, with higher scores indicating more popularity. It's calculated using internal data and external factors like media mentions. Being a relative metric, a podcast score is considered good if it's higher or similar to peers. Did you hear what that just said? It's based off of internal data and external factors like media mentions. So on one end, they base their global ranking off of something that they say is internal data, but that means absolutely nothing. And number two, they said external features like media mentions. I could just go off and buy a bunch of media mentions and make believe like my podcast is more than it is. So now you, the person that is coming to be on my podcast, you think you're all pumped up. Oh my God, I'm getting on this great podcast. Meanwhile, it's based off of such faulty data. So with that being said, the Listen Notes rating or the score has no relevance almost. And that's a big thing I've seen people get tripped up on is,
oh, the podcast isn't in the top 1%.
That is based off of absolutely no real data. So with that being said, let's move on to the third thing that I see that you need to actually stay away from. And this is probably the biggest one, because not only is it going to cost you a lot of time by going on these podcasts, but more importantly, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So Apple Podcasts and Spotify, they publish their top 100 ranked podcasts in a variety of different categories: business, health and wellness, you name it. So what ends up happening is you, as the person that's considering to be a guest on the podcast, you'll go and check, because it's public, the top charts for business, health and wellness, technology, whatever it is for you specifically. And what I have clients, I literally had somebody that I was on a call with 2 days ago, and they're like, I only want to be on podcasts that are in the top 50. And when I mentioned, I said, okay, what do you mean when you say top 50? He said, well, I go to Apple Podcasts and I look at what are the top 50 in that category. Those are the only podcasts that I want to be on. Now, here's what he did not know. What he did not know is that you actually, as a podcast host, can go and leverage platforms that are accessible that you'll pay a nominal fee, let's call it a couple $100. And what happens is the website that you sign up through, what they do is that you pay them a couple $100 and they have people overseas that they hire for $2-3 an hour. And they do it by the thousands of people, where they'll just go and listen to the podcast for 60 seconds. And what that does is it boosts your numbers. And now what happens is Apple Podcasts sees that so many people are listening to this podcast supposedly, and what ends up happening is it drives the numbers up the charts. Therefore, now a podcast is in the top 50. However, the podcast paid its way to get into the top 50. Now, let me make very clear. This is not for all of the shows that are up there. But the very easy way to tell if this was the case is if a podcast is in the top 100, 200, and you go to visit their Apple Podcast page and they only have less than 100 ratings and reviews, that's the easy way to tell that that person just bought their way there. Another thing that I've been noticing recently is that if you look at a podcast now and it has a bunch of ratings and reviews, but if you look 6 months later, I've been noticing that a lot of podcasts went from having hundreds of ratings and reviews down to like 30 or 40. Because what they did was they bought all of those ratings and reviews to drive their numbers higher. But then Apple Podcasts and Spotify, all of these major platforms are starting to catch on to all of this and are penalizing people for doing that. So with that being said, what a lot of people don't understand is a lot of these podcasts on the top charts are fugazi. They're not actually true. They're not real. So what ends up happening is you not only go on those podcasts, but number two, here's the reason why people will pay to have their podcast go to the top of the charts. Number one, they want really big guests. And what happens is really big guests, they don't really a lot of the times look into it like the way that I do and the way that we do for our clients to ensure that they're getting booked on really high quality podcasts. But they just see a big vanity metric. Oh my God, it's in the top 100. It must be a great show to go on. But more importantly, the reason why they do that is because a lot of people now are looking for ways to monetize their podcast. And one of the ways that people are doing that is they're specifically looking at charging people to be a guest on their podcast. So now if I, Devin, can say that I am in the top 50 of entrepreneurship, obviously that makes people feel like it's a very exclusive podcast to be a part of. So if I want a lot of clients, if I want to get new business, it's in the top 50. It must have so many people that are tuning into it. And what ends up happening is they end up charging 10, 20, all the way up to $50,000+ for you to be a guest on their podcast because they're in the top 50. Now, I'm going to save you a lot of time, energy, effort, and most of all, money here. If a podcast wants to charge you to be a guest on their podcast, I need you to ask them this question. Can you please send me a screenshot from this month of your podcast hosting platform numbers, aka your downloads from your podcast hosting platform? So I did this once on behalf of one of our clients, and the guy came back to me, and guess what he said?
We're in the top 1% of listen notes.
And I said, okay, I already had this email, so I knew that was total BS. I said, send me your data. Send me your metrics. Send me your downloads from your podcast hosting platform. Sure enough, he never responded. Why? Because it was complete fugazi. So with that being said, as the consumer, protect yourself, protect yourself, protect yourself. And really the last thing that I wanted to touch on here is this. Stop focusing on social media metrics. Why? I'm not going to name the podcast, but there's a show out there right now. They have about 10+ million followers on Instagram. They got a lot of people on YouTube. And what ends up happening is they charge people $10,000+ to be a guest on their show. And they make hundreds of thousands of dollars per month by charging people to be a guest on their podcast. And what ends up happening is one day they'll have somebody on that talks about astrology. The next day, this is not any exaggeration, they'll have some people that are in some very suspicious industries that just so happen to start with an O and end with an F. The next day, they'll have somebody on that's a sales trainer. The next day, they'll have somebody on that has a sneaker company. So not only is it not niche, so that means the people that are tuning in are not going to be your ideal client, but more importantly, what ends up happening is they get people to charge them 10 grand, thinking that they're going to get in front of all of these millions of people. But if you go and you look at the comments, if you look at the followers, you'll notice that it's a lot of people that are from other countries that don't speak English. Now, I love all of these people. I love people from everywhere. But for you, as the person that is thinking about potentially dropping $10,000 to $20,000 on a podcast, you better make sure that that audience is legitimate. And what ends up happening is a lot of people right now are buying followers, comments, likes, subscribers, all of it to literally rob you. And it drives me crazy because it is extremely unethical what people are doing in this podcast industry simply to make $1. And that's part of why I'm so passionate about doing the work that we do, is because we can kind of be the people that can protect our clients from going on those podcasts that they shouldn't be going on. Do you have any idea how many clients we've worked with where previous to working with us, they spent $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 going on these big podcasts that they had all of these big metrics, but got them absolutely no business. Why? Because they were focused on all of the wrong things. So with that being said, here's what I actually want you to focus on. Because the reality of the situation is you can go on a podcast that maybe even legitimately has 1 million people tuning in, but if only 0.0000000000001% of those people are actually interested in what it is that you speak about, you are going to waste your time. So whenever you're going on a podcast, I need you to really ask yourself this question. Does this podcast directly reflect my ideal audience? So what I always tell our clients, really step one in our process of what we do with clients is we need to become your best client. In other words, we must first understand what it is that you do, who it is that you serve, and the transformation that you help them experience so well that if you wanted to hire us to be your sales reps, you could. Because only then could we possibly ever, number one, identify where your people are spending their time, but more importantly, number two, identify the podcasts that directly reflect your ideal audience. Now, this is very important that you understand this next point. It's not just about going on, if you're a business owner, entrepreneurship podcast, because what I always say is it's not about just getting exposure, it's about getting exposed to the right people. And when I say right people, I mean two things. Number one, getting in front of people that are already interested in what it is that you do, or number two, are interested in achieving the end result or dream outcome that you help people achieve. So with that being said, let's say that you're somebody that works with people in cybersecurity. You help business owners protect cybersecurity. There's not going to be that many podcasts out there that talk about cybersecurity specifically for business owners. But ultimately, what's the result that you help people achieve as a result of protecting their cyber network, of being able to protect everything? Okay, if they have increased cybersecurity within their business, ultimately that's going to help them grow their business. So now if you're able to go on a podcast that's specifically designed to speak to business growth, and you go on that podcast and you articulate your message in a way where you're able to position your cybersecurity service as something that's actually going to help this business owner grow their business, then that's going to be an advantageous podcast specifically for you to be on. And then the second thing is this: you need to ask yourself the question, are these people likely to have the financial capability and willingness to pay me for what I'm worth? And the really easy way to figure that out, because that's not always publicly available, and we've actually developed something that we call Podcast Match AI, where we're able to scan literally thousands and tens of thousands of podcasts across a variety of data points and automatically match you with podcasts that have not only the demographics, but psychographics that are aligned with your offer and your ideal client. What you ultimately want to do is ask yourself the question, is this type of person that is listening to this type of podcast likely to be able to afford what it is that I have? Now, if you're going on a podcast and you do sell cybersecurity services, as an example, for upwards of $20,000 to $30,000, and you're going on a podcast speaking to business owners that are looking to start a side hustle, or I should say working professionals that are looking to start a side hustle, they probably aren't your ideal client. So probably not a good show for you to be on. So what you want to do is just look at what is the level of sophistication of this podcast, and are they likely to see the value in what it is that I do and have the financial capability to pay me for what it is that I do. So that's really the first thing to look for. It's what we call audience alignment. The second thing that you really want to look for is what we call topic alignment. In other words, on that podcast that you are considering being a guest on, what you want to look for is, does this podcast talk about topics, maybe not that are similar to exactly what it is that you do, but ultimately topics that are similar to or related to the end result that you help people accomplish. And this is ultimately what I tell people, is that whatever you do for your business, for us, we get people booked on podcasts. That is simply the vehicle that somebody can use in order to grow their business, to get more clients, to get more traffic, etc. So with that being said, understand that if you are the cybersecurity professional, they're not just there listening to
get better at cyber.
No, you help people protect their cyber network, or however it is that you want to phrase it, so that they could grow their business. So with that being said, when you're looking at these podcasts, you need to ask yourself the question, does this podcast talk about topics that are related to business growth? Because if they don't, guess what? They're not going to be related to your ideal client. And this is actually the big thing that I see with a lot of these big name podcasts, is that they're just so broad. They cover a variety of different topics that they don't attract your ideal client. Instead, they just attract a broad amount of people that are attracted to a broad variety of different topics. You want to look at this as getting in front of as many of the right people, because it's way better to get in front of 1,000 people that are already interested in what it is that you do, or interested in achieving the end result that you help people achieve. And number two, have the financial capability and willingness to pay you for your worth, rather than getting in front of 1 million people just because it pleases your ego and it makes you feel like you're a celebrity, okay? You don't want to be celebrity. You want to grow your business. So second thing is, make sure that the topics that the podcast talk about are aligned with topics that your ideal client would actually resonate with. And the third thing is what we call host and show quality. So what you actually want to do is, before you're going on a podcast, whether you're getting booked on it your own, you hired us to do it, or or you hired somebody else to help you get booked on podcasts. When they say, or when you find a podcast and they say, oh, it's a great fit for you to go on, make sure you click on that podcast and you go check out a few episodes. Listen to it. Does the audio quality sound good? Does the host come across as professional? Because if they don't, here's the thing that a lot of people don't understand, is that if you're looking to grow your brand is an association between whatever it is that you are and whatever it is that you choose to associate yourself with. So if you associate yourself with really low quality podcasts, that actually lowers your brand reputation and it doesn't help you build that authority, trust, and credibility with your audience. So what you want to make sure of is that you're checking the host and show quality. Let me check the quality of the guests that they've had on. Let me check the quality of the host and how they ask questions and how's their audio quality. Because if it sounds like somebody that just started last week in their mom's basement, it's probably not a good idea for you to go on that podcast. And I keep bringing it up 2 days ago, but I had a conversation with a business owner that worked with multiple companies in the past. And he said, yeah, one of the problems was that the people that I worked with to get me booked on podcasts, they got me booked on shows that literally didn't even produce an episode yet. They were still in pre-production getting ready to launch their podcast. AKA, they had absolutely no audience whatsoever. So with that being said, what I always recommend people is do not go on podcasts that have less than 40 episodes under their belt, because that podcast host still has a lot to learn in and of themselves. So with that being said, what we do here at podcastguest.io to ensure that we are getting clients on the right podcast is we take those 3 key factors: audience alignment, topic alignment, and host and show quality. And what we do is we give you what we call an alignment score. So you know, for every single one of the podcasts that you are going on, based out of 5 total points, here's the level of alignment for this specific podcast. Instead of telling you some BS data and metrics that mean absolutely nothing. So listen, I don't give a damn if you ever hire me, my company, to help you get booked on podcasts. But what I definitely care about is making sure that you, as the person that not only is going to spend your money on going on podcasts potentially, but more so your time, because podcasts are typically 40 to 60-ish minutes. If you're going to spend 40 to 60 minutes going on a podcast, I hope that this educated you well enough to be able to know what to look for and what to avoid when it comes to going on podcasts, so you don't make the mistakes that ultimately end up costing you thousands of dollars and hundreds or even thousands of hours of your time.